con Lars. Estamos todos muy contentos de poder conversar con él. Yo voy a ser el presentador de esta entrevista. Va a ser íntegramente en inglés, ya que mi noruego no es muy bueno. Y ahora ya vamos a proceder a comenzar. So, well, Lars, I was just introducing a bit this interview is going to be in English and things of sort. So, welcome. We are really glad to have you, to have the opportunity of talking to you. So, we're really grateful about your disposition. This is our 27th week of interviews. We've had a great response from people, and we're really happy about the level of the guests. Well, the way we are going to work through the questions is in a logical structure, starting with a little bit of history about farmhouse yeast from Norway, to the present, and what's in your opinion the future with Kveik yeast. So let's get on it. The first question is how does a computer engineer arrive to the world of craft beer and wild yeasts?
Well, it started with just the beer. So was traveling for an IT conference, and this was in Barcelona. And I noticed they had a lot of beer that you couldn't get in Norway. And so I started trying them, and I was surprised at the way that there could be many different flavors. That was really something that I hadn't expected. And there was this one bar that had a row of bottles, like all the different brands that they were selling. And since we were there for a week, I decided I was going to do them one by one. And new surprises for every bottle, and that's really how I got started. I got interested in the flavor, and then later, I got into start using rate beer, searching for different types of beer, seeing what I could find, and I did that for quite a few years. And then I stumbled on the Farmhouse ale, actually in Lithuania, and that really got me interested because I could tell from the flavors that this was something other than the kind of beer that I knew from before, and it wasn't in any of my beer books. Nobody had written about this. Nobody had talked about it anywhere. And that led quite quickly to the Kveik, basically. So once I came home from Lithuania, I started thinking, we have something like this in Norway. And then when we started looking into it, we found, they have their own yeast in Voss, and let's go and look at that. And that's kind of how it got started.
Great. Yeah, you just answered the second question, so
okay,
really good. And the next question is about what's the relation for the people of Norway, for like the people of Norway from the countryside and the city with these beers? Is common to find them, or is just something regional in Norway?
Historically, like a long time ago, every household in Norway brewed, except maybe in the towns, which we didn't have a lot of. So historically, everyone had their own yeast. There was no alternative, and this was something that people took good care of and preserved from brew to brew. And if you had an accident and it went bad or you lost it, you would go to your neighbor and get fresh yeast. But people made special equipment for keeping the yeast, and they had their methods for keeping the yeast alive. And then most of this died out. I made a video where you can see year by year where the tradition disappears, and you see it's on the coast, and also the most central areas in eastern Norway where it dies first. This is the brewing though, not the yeast, but the two are closely linked. So today it's only a few regions where people still have their own yeast, and it's typically agricultural areas that are quite isolated. And before, people would have yeast in every house. Today, it's just a few. So even in Voss and Hornindal, which are kind of the main centers, it's maybe 10, 20 people, maybe a little bit more in each place that has the yeast, and then some scattered people here and there. And for people in the cities, even the existence of this was completely unknown. Like almost nobody had ever heard of this before we started digging it up in 2014, which is really strange, but that's how it was.
Well, that's awesome.
I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that's perfectly. So you guys did.
Oops, you're breaking up. You need to say that again.
No, the question is, if you, in this path towards getting to know these yeasts, did you even knew the word like Kveik, or it was a complete discovery once you go to these isolated parts?
I didn't even know the word. So the I bought this book. It was published in 1969. It's based on thousands of pages of ethnological documentation, and it lists the various dialect words. But in this book, which is based on how things were first half of the 20th century, there's nothing special about Kveik. Everyone still has yeast. So the word doesn't stand out. And then the first piece of writing that I found about it was articles by Michael Jackson, of all people. He had been to Voss and he had collected yeast and he'd brewed with the brewers and all that stuff. But he didn't remark on the word. It was yeast, and he didn't care what people called it. So, but it was when I started digging into Norwegian sources on Voss, that there were people on forums saying, yeah, they call the yeast Kveik. And then when we came there, we found that in Voss, the dialect word for yeast is Kveik. But now they actually use two words for yeast. Kveik. So now Kveik means their own yeast. And the standard Norwegian word, jar, that's the thing you buy in the shops.
Yeah.
So they have they have two terms actually.
Yeah, they split. No, that's really good, because Kveik is only from Norway, because there are all of these farmhouse ale yeasts in other parts of Northern Europe, right?
Yes. The words that were used for yeast in different countries were quite obviously partly from the same roots. So if you look at the Belgian bottles, it will say hoge gisting. Gist is the yeast. That's the same as from the same root as English yeast, and from the same root as the most common word in Norway, which was jester.
Yes.
And also the Swedish jest. Quite obviously all the same term. But even England had more than one word for farmhouse yeast. So if you look at the documentation on English and Scottish farmhouse brewing, they actually call the yeast barm. Which we also have in Norway. Some areas people call their yeast barm, and other places barm just means the dregs. And there were more words as well, gong, and there were also some quite specialized terms, but we don't need to do all of that.
No, it's really interesting. Yeah, because here at least in Latin America, there's more association in the with the Nordic or countries with meat than with beer. So
oh, that's really weird. That's really strange.
yeah, because here
Okay,
is like
I want to say something about that.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, the Old Norse sagas and writings, there is a good bit about mead, but for the most part, it has been impossible to keep bees or even to find wild bees in Norway. The exception is like the Oslo Fjord, like a tiny corner in the south. And even like southern Sweden and Denmark, where people kept bees, bees were actually need quite a lot of space. And if you fill all that space with grain, then there's not a lot of pollen for them to collect. So it's just not possible to produce a lot of honey, like relative to the number of people who live somewhere. So honey was always really expensive, and in Norway it had to be imported. So the reason that they mention mead, it's kind of bragging almost. It's the second most highly ranking drink. So wine, which has to come all the way from Southern Europe, is even more expensive and therefore also even more highly regarded. But there was never much of a mead tradition in Norway. There is a questionnaire from 1952, 182 answers from all of Norway, and 5 places they say there was a tradition for making mead. And those 5 places are all in that southeastern corner where you actually can keep bees, or where you could keep bees before you learned better techniques, because it is possible to do it in the whole country if you just know what you're doing.
Yeah, but it wasn't in the past. So you're a home brewer, right?
I used to call myself an away brewer, in the sense that I would go and visit people and brew with them to learn what they were doing. But I've realized that just because you saw somebody do it doesn't mean that you know how it works. Yeah. So I have started home brewing, but I've done 4 beers, 3 Lithuanian Keptinis, and 1 raw ale, and it was all just to learn how it works.
So you're learning about making beer was in parallel with the discovery of these yeasts?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the interest is this whole tradition of farmhouse brewing, and the yeast is just a part of it. But of course, I ferment with Kveik every time I brew because I try to learn how to use it.
Great. So, well, you've talked about a bit how you got to these yeasts, but what was the turning point when you decided to start going to these places and collecting yeast and doing all this work?
Right. Again, I'm doing all this work to collect information on the brewing tradition and how people brew in these places, because it's basically not recorded. It's almost impossible to, or outside of like really archive documents that you need to be a professional to access. There was no available documentation on how the people brew here versus there, and even the stuff that's in the archive is quite deficient. So my goal was to learn how people were brewing, what the flavors were, and this kind of thing. And then if they had yeast, of course, I would collect it while I was at it.
So you started filling the blanks. Never stopped.
yeah. I mean, if you wanted, let's say you wanted to know in 2013 mash temperatures in Norwegian farmhouse brewing, good luck. Like maybe you could find 2 examples for the whole country.
Great. And what was the reaction of these people when you arrived them and started talking about this interest in knowing their history and the way they do what they do, and how was that first interaction?
Right. It was a few people, not many, but a few people were like, don't want to talk to you. No, nope, go away. And then other people were, well, you can kind of imagine it for yourself. Let's say you have this hobby that you do at home, and nobody really cares what you're doing, and then you know, these writers from the capital show up, and they want to interview you and take photos of everything you do and write about it. And you know, for a lot of people, that's nice. It's like, hey, I get some attention. And also, these people were aware that they were the carriers of a tradition that was almost dead, and that was old, and that was important. And they were also very happy to have for this to finally get some attention.
No.
It must have been really strange to watch the rest of your country go, ooh, brown ale, ooh, porter, and then it's like, yeah, I'm making Norwegian beer, and nobody gives a shit. Basically, that must have been really awful.
Yeah, what a great experience. So, well, once you got there, you just kept going, right? And you went to all places, other countries. What were like the most common, or basically which elements are did you find common to the practice of how they do these farmhouse sales in different countries, and what were the main differences?
Right. A lot of, I guess what you can say is economics, if you will. The economic of the individual farm drives how these beers are put together, but they are in very different places. So they share some technology, but you know, some people brew with oats because it's what they have. Some people brew with rye because it's what they have. So I guess the main things that really tie them together, apart from just being beer, is you made your own malts because it was your own grain that you were using, that you had grown yourself. That's why you could afford to brew, because you weren't buying anything. You were just taking things that you already had. But there are some strange commonalities. So one is the use of juniper, which you find all the way from Western Norway, basically almost to the Ural Mountains, and from Northern Norway down to the Alps. Skipping some places where there isn't a lot of juniper, like the British Isles and Denmark and so on. And then very high fermentation temperatures, like with Kveik. So body temperature typically. And very short fermentations, like very, very, very short. 24 to 48 hours for the most part before you harvest the yeast. And then no carbonation.
Oh, they didn't quit flat.
Well, think about it. So you have no pressurized container. You have no pressurized container. You can't add gas. You can't measure the sugar, and nothing else that you've ever tasted is carbonated. How is your beer going to be? It's not going to be carbonated. They've started doing it a bit now that they have plastic containers that they can close and so on. So they're used to carbonated drinks from other sources, and now they're kind of experimenting with it and putting a little more carbonation in. But before it was like English cask ale, just naturally carbonated.
Awesome. And what's the relation that these people have with this beverage? It's just a kind of beer. It's they feel it. Do you think it's more like a part of the way they live, or it's just another drink they have once a year?
Right. So this has been in different areas. This has been a little different, and again because of the economics. But if you look at where Kveik comes from, Western Norway, you didn't have enough grain to make a lot of beer, so you would typically make it, say, twice a year for the haymaking, which is when you cut the hay that you will feed the animals, and for Christmas. And well, those are the regular brews, but you would also brew for basically for any gathering that was important. So for a wedding, for a funeral, for a baptism, also for some rituals that we don't have anymore. But it's hard to really explain this to modern human beings. But this drink was holy. This was not like water or sour milk. This was something that was really important. So in Western Norway, only the men were allowed to brew. And if you did some kind of sacrifice to your ancestors or to the gods, you would sacrifice beer.
Yeah,
this was this was yes. So this was ritual that went on in parts of Western Norway, I'm told, into the 20th century. So most farms had a burial mound with a tree on it. And the burial mound was where your ancestor, the person who cleared the farm, they were buried in this mound. Usually you knew the name of this person. And you would make sacrifices on Christmas, or your luck would run out, let's put it that way. No, this was very important. And it was also important in another way, that it had to be good, because you grew the grain. It was the product of your farm where your family came from. You made the malts and then you brewed. So if this beer was weak or it was not good, then either you were poor or you were a stingy bad person, or you just didn't have the skill to brew. So as late as the 1990s, I was told that in Voss, you were, as a man, you were judged on two things. It was how good you were as a farmer and how good your beer was. And everyone knew how good your beer was. You could just ask anybody, what's this guy's beer like? And they would know.
Oh, that's crazy.
It was quite important.
Awesome. So we wanted to talk a bit about Kveik yeast, and so we're gonna pass to another part of the interview. So there's something when you talk about to a brewer and you say Farmhouse ale, they almost immediately think of a saison style beer. But in your opinion, what really makes a Farmhouse ale? There's something, any other element that you find that's common beyond the way they're made?
Yeah, I think the reason that people associated Farmhouse ale with saison is it was the only example they knew of. Yeah. Right? If you lived your whole life in a box and the only animal you've seen is a cat, then cats are going to shape your thinking about animals. That's just how it is. Well, the thing that makes something a Farmhouse ale is really that it comes out of this tradition where the farmers brewed from their own grain. That's what makes something a Farmhouse ale. And originally, that's the only kind of beer there was. It was different in different places, but it was the only type of beer. And then you've got commercial breweries, and they started out using the same methods and then developed the industrial tradition, which is what modern home brewers basically brew in, although they've just scaled it back down.
Yeah.
But it's anything that kind of descends from this tradition of people brewing from their own grain, that's Farmhouse ale. As simple as that.
Great. And within the Farmhouse ales of Norway, is there any particular common element that you think defines what a Farmhouse ale from Norway is?
Well, it's a pretty rare one that doesn't use juniper. That's kind of and then what I said before, right? But Norway is divided up by mountains and had pretty poor internal communication. So pretty much everything differs from place to place. So Eastern Norway has different brewing processes from Western Norway, and Western Norway has two main groups. And then there were different types of equipment for making the malt, and there were a lot of differences.
Oh,
Like you could draw up a lot of different styles if you just wanted to.
getting into that, can we talk about the style in farmhouse ale brewing? Like, it's the definition of styles. Does it exist?
Well, I mean, it's not that it still exists; it's the other way around. It never used to exist for the farmers because
Yeah, that was the question actually. If they
yeah,
had this
right.
notion of style.
And now we do, and then before they didn't, because um, if you think about it, a style is something that the brewer puts on the bottle or on the tap, right? To tell the customer what kind of beer is this before they've tried it. But if you know, historically, if you went to Voss, to a farm, well, they had one kind of beer. And it was always the same because, you know, they had this malt kiln and they had these hops and this yeast and they knew one process. So it was always the same beer. And if you went to the next farm, it would be pretty much the same beer. So nobody talked about styles back then. But today, the brewing has a lot of the differences have died out basically. So and you have these pockets where people brew the same way. So now you can talk about styles. So there's three big living styles. The one in Voss and the areas around. The one is called Kornøl, the raw ale from further north. And then the intensely smoky beer from Stjørdal. And there are also people brewing in Eastern Norway, and they do completely different things, but there aren't so many brewers. It's kind of hard to talk about the style.
Okay. So, getting a little back to history, in your investigation, or what's the data about for how long have these people been brewing? What's the
Right. Very good question. So let's put it this way. We can't really document any period where we know that they didn't brew. Except, of course, before agriculture began in Norway, before they started growing grain. That's 6,000 years ago.
6,000.
So if you try and go back from today, you find that in Viking times, people were required by law to brew. So obviously everyone brewed. And if you go back a few more centuries to say 5th century or thereabouts, there are a lot of little pieces of metal and other objects that have single words scratched on them. They seem to have been used in some sort of ritual, but we don't know what. The most common word is beer. And you find other inscriptions referring to beer as far back as that. But if you go into archaeology, then you can go even further back. So 1500 before Christ in Denmark, it was common to bury people with beer in the grave as an offering. And of course, you know, the first beer you brew is you're not going to do that with this. If you bury the beer with people, you have time to develop this ritual. So we don't know when it began, but it was a very long time ago.
It's really weird that they've survived this long. Maybe the same reason why they're so different. This difficult integration.
Yes, it had a long time to diverge. Absolutely.
So there's a question about the historic relation farmhouse sales from Norway.
You froze. I lost a few seconds. Sorry.
No, the next question is about if there's any historic relation between German beers and farmhouse ales from Norway, or it's a different kind of apparition. I mean, did the tradition of brewing beer came from the continent towards Scandinavia, or it was a development in itself?
Well, I mean, given that we don't know when it started, it's very difficult to see where it came from, if you to put it that way. So
Yeah.
we do know how agriculture was brought to Norway, and that was from the continent, from Denmark, and they again got it from Germany. But the groups that brought agriculture up here, they were not Germans or Norwegians. They were not Indo-Europeans at all. They were descending from cultures in the Middle East.
Yeah.
We don't know what kind of language they spoke. If you look at methods in Norwegian brewing, and then try and compare with what we know about German brewing and German farmhouse brewing, there is a type of vessel that you use to filter, well, the Lauterton, basically.
Yeah.
There was one style of that has been used in the UK, in Germany, but also way into Russia and in Scandinavia. But it's impossible to say where it came from. And it's from the geographical distribution, it looks like maybe the Swedes invented a modern and better version, but then spread into Norway, or from Norway to Sweden, but probably from Sweden. I think hops probably were introduced from the continent because they don't grow wild in Scandinavia. So that's, but you know, was it introduced from the UK? Probably not, since they were so late to use it. But it doesn't have to have been introduced from Germany. It could just as well have been the East, actually.
Yeah.
But so much of this is so hazy that we don't really know.
Oh, for sure, it's an ongoing investigation.
Yes.
So, Industrial Revolution changed drastically the way that beer was, for example, made in England, where it started. What was that effect in Norway?
Yeah, that is a very good question. So, if you look at farmhouse brewing as it was practiced, if we pick a date, let's say 1900, the technological impact on that had happened over the last few centuries before was, I can only think of one thing, actually, the introduction of the metal kettle. Other than that, I don't think anything had changed. That's not quite right. They had the water mills that they used to mill the malt that were introduced. Yeah, that's it.
That's about it. Yeah.
Yeah. So there was, just to be clear, I mean, there was absolutely no mechanical help of any kind whatsoever apart from that water mill. They carried the water from the well and all of that stuff. The heating was by, wood fire, no sugar measuring, no thermometers.
Yeah.
Like the filter was juniper and straw.
Crazy. So keeping a bit in the same subject, what about malt in Norway? Does it grow well? What kind of malts are available? Is there any particular kind of I forgot the English word for it. Cebada.
You mean the type of grain, or?
No, yeah. I forgot the English word. Just like barley. Thanks, Johan.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that is quite a big subject. I'll try to walk through it. So, in general, in Norway, you couldn't grow wheat. Basically, it was too far north, and wheat requires too much sun. It just didn't work. So there was very little rye. So the choice in Norway was mostly between oats and barley, and people preferred barley. They thought barley made better beer, but on the west coast, it was so humid and cold in the summers that oats gave the best results. So where they could, people would have like a small field for barley for the beer, and then the rest would be oats. But if you want to know about the type of barley, then I'm afraid you're in for disappointment, because basically the kind of barley wheat rye that has been grown in Europe has changed totally since 1900. So the kind of grain that people grew before then is almost all dead, and it was dramatically different from the grain that we have today. If you see photos of people in old grain fields, the grain goes up to here. Now it goes to your knees, and the plants they didn't look the same. And you know, today when you look at a row of barley plants, they all look the same, but they didn't do that before, because this was grain that was brought to Norway 6,000 years ago, and of course it wasn't genetically identical then. They were just taking part of the harvest, sowing it, harvesting again, sowing part of it, and just recycling like this for literally thousands of years. So in fact, it could happen that if in a place you had a bad harvest and you had to buy seed grain, you bought it from somewhere else and you plant it, and it grows really badly because it had adapted to this place that you bought it from and not where you planted it.
Yeah.
But mostly they used two-row barley because they thought the bigger grains was better. Today, most people buy the malt, and they buy foreign malt. But in Stjørdal, they still make their own malt from the local barley, and the local barley is still mostly derived from the original Norwegian types, but it has been through systematic breeding, so it's changed quite a lot.
It's better.
It's actually kind of funny. The first deliberately bred and pure sort of Norwegian barley was launched in 1916. And by accident, that barley is fantastic for beer brewing. Descendants of it were used in Canadian beer brewing into the 1990s, actually. And some people in Stjørdal, they love this type of barley so much that they are still using it, although you can't buy it. So it was the first pure sort, and they have gone back to the old method of harvesting and sowing again. So they're turning it back into a kind of wild grain. It's really weird, but it's true.
And what about the malting process? Like the process, the tradition. Wait, how they do it?
Okay. I have a lot of data on the malting process, and it is totally confusing. So practices varied everywhere. If you look at how long did they soak it, how did they soak it, when they took it out, how long did it sprout? You know, did you have a thick layer? Did you have a thin layer? All of these are things that affect the flavor in the end, but they were massively different from place to place. Maybe because they had grains that were different. It's hard to tell. You know, did you turn the malt while it was growing? Some did, some didn't. Did you take off the rootlets? Some did, some didn't. I mean, you get the picture. And then if you look at how the malt was dried, the thing that I learned is that if you want to dry malts, the only thing that you actually have to do is don't get it so hot that you destroy the enzymes, and make sure you get the humidity out before it goes moldy. As long as you do that, you'll have malt and it will be fine. So they did, I mean, anything you can imagine. People built houses where you have a fire and you raise the grain quite far off from the fire, and then you let the smoke go through planks with holes in them and through the malt. That's how they make malt in Stjørdal today. You get a really, really smoked beer. But the most common method was to build a little house, a sauna, and you have just a pile of rocks in the middle of the room. You light the fire inside it, and you just heat the house, and there's shelves where you put the grain, so they dry. But you could dry it in the sun, spread it out on a sail and just take it in at night and then put it back in the morning. You could dry it in an iron pot. You have to stir a lot. There is actually a special Norwegian type of equipment that's shaped so that it fits into the bottom of the pot. That was used specifically for this, because you have to stir rapidly to avoid burning the malt.
Yeah.
And there were even people who used hot stones to dry the malt. You take small stones and heat them. Then one person drops them in the malt, and the other person stirs like crazy. So I mean, if you can think of a method, they probably used it.
Yeah, trial and error.
Yes.
If it works,
absolutely.
it works. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
So no, you already addressed the next question, but mainly the grains used to brew Kveik would be oats, barley. It's any other grain used?
Yeah, mostly barley. And the Kveik that we have today comes from quite far inland, quite far away from the coast. So this was mainly the barley regions.
Great. So any other grains? Maybe rye sometimes, depending on the.
A little bit of rye, just a little bit. But this needs to be said. So in my total data set on Farmhouse Brewing, something like 720 individual descriptions from different places. I think there's 6 mentions of using wheat.
Oh, whoa.
Yeah, and
Really
even
strong.
if you get down into southern Sweden, you know, when people mention wheat, they say things like, "Yeah, my neighbor tried it once. It's really good beer, but it's too expensive."
Yeah.
Forget it. Yeah. In Germany, probably.
Talk
The
about
UK,
this
probably.
relationship they have. Yeah. It's really weird because it's like a modern homebrew club when you go and talk about what are you brewing, your neighbor, it's doing the same. It's really fun. So in our current times, we're really conscious about the mineral content in water.
Yeah.
And what's like the traditional water profile in which this beer were made?
Right. The water profile depended on the geology, right, in each area. So Norway is like all mountain and you know, hard granite and gravel. So very little chalk and minerals in the water. Like in Western Norway, the water you brewed with, that will have melted up in the mountains 24 hours ago and run down to you. Not a lot of minerals, let's put it that way.
Really
But Denmark is completely different. So underground is mostly chalk, and if you go to Denmark today and you turn the water tap and you drink the water, most people go full because it's so chalky. It's like unbelievably chalky. So in Denmark, they did actually care about the water profile, and they when they wanted to make good strong beer for a celebration, they would try to find water that wasn't so chalky. And I know people in Lithuania also did some tricks to get rid of the chalk in the water. Like you boil it and then you wait and you let the carbonate precipitate out, and then you use And also in Chuvashia in Russia, I know people try to use snow meltwater and stuff like that to avoid the minerals.
No.
The water there was actually so mineral, that it formed like a film on top of the water. Yeah, it's all experience. I mean, these people knew no chemistry, absolutely none.
That's awesome. So the next question is about, let's get in the yeast. First of all, for the people that haven't read about it, what does Kveik means? the word?
The word itself is actually quite interesting. It means to bring to make something alive. It comes from an old word that really just mean alive. So in English, you have the expression the quick and the dead. And the quick is not a metaphor. It's a remnant of the same old word that means just alive. The living and the dead, that's all it means. But in Norwegian, this kveik came to be used as a noun, so no, as a verb. Sorry, you could kveik something, but you could kveik the fire. And the most common use of it, if you search old books, is actually people saying that they are going to put kveik into the abstinence work. Abstinence was getting people to not drink alcohol. Which is mildly ironic. Yeah. So, but what's happening is you have this thing and you put it into the beer and the beer becomes alive.
Yeah.
You are putting life into the beer.
So it became a noun. Yeah, because the next question actually was, the next question is, I asked you because I didn't want to pronounce it bad, but could you explain for the people that's listening how it's the correct pronunciation of the word?
Kveik.
Kveik.
Yeah. Yep.
Nice. For example, if you were to talk about someone that's never heard about these yeasts, for you, which one would be the characteristics that make them so special?
I guess the fast fermentation, high tolerance of temperature, without making bad flavors. In fact, the big range that they can handle, the fact that it can be dried, and I guess also the fact that it's kind of sort of like normal yeast in the flavor profile. It's different, but it's not dramatically different. It's not like saison yeast where
it's not phenolic, right?
It just makes a completely different kind of beer.
That was, for me at least, the greatest surprise that they didn't have this.
Well, it was your first meeting with a non-cat, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the next question was actually about the way it became a verb. It's correct to talk about Kveik fermentation. It's perfectly.
Well, I'm not sure I understand the question.
No,
I mean, you can say that you ferment with Kveik. Yeah, sure.
No, I mean Kveik as an adjective, like it's Kveik fermentation, or the way you just.
Right. It would be a neologism, a new way to use the word, but it wouldn't be wrong. I can't see that there would be something wrong with it.
Yeah, and for example, in these places, there probably were like mixed with other kinds of yeast, or like they were not a pure culture, right?
That's right. Yeah, so there's kind of two related issues here. So if you look at the culture, the one that Farmhouse brewer uses, there are many types of yeast in there, many strains. And it seems how many depends how carefully you look, basically. But let's take an example. So there were researchers in Belgium that took 26 cultures, and they picked out 1,250 individual strains, and then they looked at them genetically and they removed the duplicates. And then they had 188 left. All of those 188 were Kveik. They belong to the Kveik family. They didn't find anything else.
It's crazy.
That's not to say that there hasn't been wild yeast in there, because it has happened in a few cases, like one or two, and there has been bacteria sometimes.
Yeah, so they're
But
mixed, but not necessarily wild in that way. There's no.
they are not wild. We know that Kveik is not wild.
What?
That's absolutely certain.
So crazy. In your opinion, it's the flavor has been affected by the way that now they're being reproduced in like pure strain.
As pure strains. I don't know. I mean, I've never brewed with a single strain.
Yeah, it's the one.
So
the way we get them over here.
Well, that's hard to say. In fact, that's the next thing I want to try. The day before yesterday, I had a series of 3 beers. They were all made with different strains from the same Kveik. And they were quite different from each other, but these were strains that there isn't a lot of in that Kveik. So they just make a very small amount of the flavor. So what I wanted to try was okay, I have the original Kveik, it's in my freezer. So take a beer, make a wort, and ferment half of it with the original and half of it with the commercial version, and then compare. But I haven't done it yet. I can't tell you the result. But I think that potentially, if when you pick the pure strain, if you pick one that's rare by accident, you could end up with something that's unrepresentative, that doesn't taste like the full culture at all.
Yeah.
But probably the yeast labs know better than to do that, I would think.
Yeah, maybe they pick the one that's more closely that more closely resembles the entire.
I hope so. When Carlsberg did this, they did not. They did the opposite. They picked one that was very different from how the full culture tastes, and I don't know why.
Yeah. Talking about actually about these. The next one is about. Is there any specific reason why they can handle this really high temperature fermentation temperatures, like this range?
No, we don't know actually. There are microbiologists that are looking into this. There's a group at the University of Guelph that's actually been working on stress response in yeast for a long time, and heat is one type of stress.
Yeah.
And what they found is genetically, Kveik seems to have a whole complex, a whole set of genes for handling stress that's different. But they haven't done a paper on how it's different yet.
You're trying to figure out. So.
Yes, but there is a real difference there.
And what was the first reaction when you got this yeast to a lab?
Well, they had actually analyzed the Kveik before. This was a national collection of yeast cultures in Norwich, and they got the Kveik in 2009. So when I sent them Sigmund's Kveik, their reaction was, yeah, this is pretty much what we expected. No bacteria, 3 different strains. It's related to the other one from Voss that we already have. But they didn't look at brewing properties. They just analyzed it. Yeah, we found yeast. It looks like it's good yeast. Yeah, good stuff. Yeah. Thank you. And I put it in the archive. I tried to ask them, so is there something special about this yeast? And they said, it has moderately well-developed pseudomycelia. some kind of hairs on the cells that you can see in the microscope.
Another approach to
Yeah, but there is a better version, and that is when Escarpment Labs was working on this. I sent them dried flakes, and Richard Priest, took one flake of each and put them in these little, glasses of wort, went off to lunch, and came back 45 minutes later to find that they were fermenting. And as he said, I knew then that this wasn't normal yeast.
Yeah, that's a big surprise ahead.
Yeah, he was like, maybe all these crazy things are true that I heard about it.
Because they're really crazy.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
In that way, can you consider Kveik yeast as a domesticated yeast, or just a wild yeast that got collected and reproduced, or how do you think or what's their origin?
Right. Well, if you look at, I mean, all the brewer's yeast that we have is wild yeast that was collected and well, not collected, but they got into brewing somehow and stayed there, and then it was domesticated. And so what we know about Kveik is, I guess, three things. So one thing is, if you look at the properties, it behaves like domesticated yeast. It's adapted to the way that it's being used. The other thing is, anywhere that you go in Western Norway, when you knock on people's doors, if they have a yeast, it always belongs to this family. You never get anything else. And this is over quite a large area. So it must have been in use there for a long time to have spread out and covered the area completely. And then the last thing that we know is that it was formed by two yeasts mating, two quite different yeasts. And one of those was from the beer 1 group, which is where almost all the other brewers yeast is, like US05 and Nottingham and all of those, and Hefeweizen yeasts and blah, blah, blah. And those were domesticated already at the point when this mating happened. But we don't know what the... Ooh, I need to change headsets, just a second.
Okay, no problem.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly.
Yeah, the other one ran out of battery.
Great. So you were talking about where one side came, the other one is...
Yeah, the other ancestor has been profiled genetically, but if you try to put it into the family tree of yeasts, it has no neighbors. So we haven't a clue what it is. So I've been trying to collect wild yeast from Western Norway in the hope that will give us some clues. I mean, if the wild yeast from different places in Western Norway is similar and not like the ancestor, okay, we'll know that's not it. But at the moment, we just don't know.
Yeah, but it's the only way to look for it. So.
Yes.
And because, for example, it's really normal for homebrewers all around the world to use dry yeast. It's not that common for us to be able of getting liquid yeast in many places. So one of the most surprising things about this yeast is how easy it is to get to be dried and withstand the process. Where does this ability come from to
handle drying? To
handle drying.
Well, wild yeast can handle drying, right? So the most likely explanation is that brewer's yeast lost it because it didn't need it. Brewer's yeast was used in the brewery, it was repitched all the time, and it lost this ability. But in Norway, people brewed, like I said, typically twice a year. So when I look at, did people dry the yeast or keep it liquid? In Norway, it was almost all dried. it was the safest way to keep it for 6 months, basically. In places where they kept the yeast liquid, they often were changing the water very often so it wouldn't go moldy and all of that stuff, which was too much work, basically, when you're gonna keep it 6 months, and too risky. Yeah. So it probably never lost the ability to handle drying, and any yeast that did lose it would just die. Kind of the opposite of in the brewery situation.
You got stuck.
Oh,
or maybe it's me. I don't know. I just listened till the ones that can't get dry, they die. I didn't hear anything else.
Oh, but I stopped there.
Oh,
that was the end.
Yeah. So the screen
you got it
moving. Yeah.
Yep.
Great. And no, it's already stuck. Many people talk about Kveik as a big group of strains, not only from Norway, but instead they include other strains like from Lithuania. That's not correct, right? They're only from.
Well, I mean, originally it meant just yeast, right? I in the beginning, when we first started with this, I used Kveik to mean farmhouse yeast, any traditional farmhouse yeast, because there wasn't any, we didn't have a word for it, and I thought, okay, let's use Kveik. But when we found that all the Kveiks from Western Norway were a single family, a single type of yeast, really. The share, had very specific characteristics in common, and they were also genetically all the same group. I decided we should call them Kveik. And so I call the others farmhouse yeast now. But I mean, there's no language police that will put you in jail if you do this the other way.
Great. Have you had any other experience with Kveik, fermenting cider or mead or making bread, for example?
Yeah, I haven't made bread with it, but I have made both mead and cider with it. The cider fermented quickly, and I drank it, I think, after a week, 2 weeks, no, 10 days it was.
10 days.
It was perfectly fine. I mean, it tasted like cider, which I don't like. So, but that wasn't the Kveik's fault, right? And I did mead with it as well, and it was quickly fermented, drinkable, pretty much right away. But you should know that Kveik has only been used for beer, and it's been used for strong beer. And when you, like Vossøl is 12%. When they rehydrate the yeast, it's typically in the first wort that comes off the Lauterton, so that will be the strongest of all. So Kveik is very used to having a lot of nutrients, which you have in wort, which you don't have in cider and you don't have in honey. Yeah. So you can run into issues, and it really is a good idea to put in yeast nutrient to be on the safe side.
Great. Apparently the most important strains, or more common, are Voss and Hornindal. Hornindal, how
Hornindal.
Like, can you repeat it, please?
Hornindal.
Hornindal.
Or you can do like the locals and say Hundarn.
Oh,
that's very typical in Norway. That the name that's on the map is not what the locals use.
Yeah. Can you talk about us a bit about the flavor characteristics of these two strains?
Sure. The Voss Kveik that comes from Sigmund is mostly oranges, kind of lightly oranges, a little spice. Some people call it orange peel. If there is another one from Voss, the number 2, which also adds a little acid. Kveik in general lowers the pH, and this number 2 lowers it so that you can taste it. It doesn't get sour, but you can like pick it up. The Hornindal is more. Now we have to distinguish. So if you use the original culture with everything in it, there are actually 3 components. There is tropical fruits. There is something vaguely like mushrooms, and some kind of milk caramel. I know that probably sounds insane, but it does work quite well together. But the purified versions will be the tropical fruit only.
Yeah, that's. I don't know, but we're done. Well, we just got to 1 hour. Do you want to stop for 5 minutes? Maybe go to the bathroom, have a glass of water.
Sure.
And
No, I'm fine. Let's keep going.
But, it's because we usually stop for a minute because maybe the people that's also watching, they need to get a coffee or something. So
yeah, that's fine.
Let's take 5 minutes and we'll be right back. And
sure.
Well, I'm going to speak Spanish for a little. Chicos, bueno, vamos a parar por 5 minutos por si alguno tiene que ir al baño, tomar un poco de agua, prepararse un café o lo que le haga falta. Entonces volvemos exactamente a las 18:11 hora de Chile. En un minutito. Really interesting the subject. Just a couple of minutes more wouldn't make a difference. So we just talked about Voss and Horndal. I don't know if that's how it's pronounced. So if you had to make like a small overview of how it's Norwegian farmhouse ale made, could you run us over the process? Like,
well, I kind of explained the malting process.
Yeah.
Which was always the first part, so I'll skip that.
Yeah, just go to the brewing.
Yeah. Okay, so there are many processes that are different from each other. Western Norway was typically infusion mashing. Eastern Norway had what I call complex mashing, so many different ways of doing it. And then there was stone brewing as well. Some people boiled the wort, some people didn't boil the wort. And some people did things where it's kind of hard to determine if they boiled it or not. And then there is also evidence of people, you pour hot juniper infusion on the malt, so it's an infusion mash. You just let it cool, then you pitch the yeast, and then 2 days later, you lauter the finished beer.
Oh, the lautering is after the fermentation.
Yes. So you ferment in the mash. So like I said, there's a lot of variation.
You just need to get it a little bit cooler, not that much actually.
Yeah, really well, you just wait, right? So, yeah, and in Eastern Norway, there's no system to where people boiled and where people didn't, but in Western Norway there is. So there's a great glacier that kind of divides Western Norway in half, and north of there they didn't boil, and south of there they did boil. And there's also differences in the boiling, because some people boil 4 hours and concentrate the wort, and other people just boil normally.
Great. Yeah, because most of the images that we see about these kind of beers, they're like really rustic. No, that's the word. The equipment is really not that modern to say.
No.
Is there
But
any?
there are people who brew with a completely normal modern process, even though they have the old equipment.
Yeah, that's the question. But is there any commercial brewery making beers that are kind of similar but with modern techniques?
Yeah, there are. In Stjørdal, there are 3 different producers that make takes on the local smoke beer. And then there is a gypsy brewery. They have no physical plant. 2 of them actually that make takes on the traditional beer. And there's another brewery that also makes the local Voss style.
Right.
But there isn't a lot, really. And if you go back 6 years, there was nothing.
Yeah, it's with the news. But and we wanted to ask you about juniper, because it's, as you already said, it's really common they use. And what's its importance? It's in the flavor, or how would you define the importance of juniper in this kind of brewing?
Right. It's several things. So all the wooden equipment was always cleaned with juniper infusion, and this was, in fact, also for any dairy work, like you were making cheese or sour milk, you would also clean the equipment with juniper infusion. So people believed that it had, they didn't call it antibacterial, but they said it was good for removing bad smells. And then it's used in the mash water, which lowers the pH, so quite possibly gave them better efficiency.
Right.
And then you do pick it up in the flavor, and it adds, it's actually different from the other brewing herbs. So if you like Myrica Gale, that's the Latin term, sweet gale. That was one of the most common brewing herbs, and it's like, it's a really, like, it tastes of gale, only that.
Yeah.
A juniper is much more subtle and has several flavor components, and it adds bitterness as well. So it is used for the flavor. People did traditionally say that juniper flavor was one of the flavors that your beer should have. It's also to balance the sweetness, but you know, it's like this whole range of things that it was used for.
Right. Yeah, because in some areas it's not really easy to find juniper. How would you define the flavor? And maybe you have any experience of which, how can we replace it with, if we want to recreate something like
my knowledge of South American botany is not very big.
Yeah, no.
So finding suitable, I'm not sure I can help you with that. But I can talk about the flavor of it for sure. With juniper, it actually matters. There's a whole bunch of variables. So what most people say, not everyone, what most people say is you should have the thin branches, not the thick ones. What I found is if you boil the thick ones, your beer afterwards tastes like you put cleaning solvent in it, like really, like you screwed up on that. It's that's what I thought happened the first 2 times. And there is a difference between boiling the twigs and just steeping them. You get a more subtle flavor with the steeping, and you can get more flavor without it becoming too bitter. Well, part of it is, surprise, surprise, it's a kind of woody flavor, something green, almost mossy, minerally as well. But you can also get, weirdly, you can also get some kind of quite fruit-like characteristics.
Like which kind of fruit, maybe?
Kind of like, almost like strawberry sometimes.
Like a berry.
Yeah.
Unexpected.
So Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, but those are all flavors that you can get out of hops. So maybe the obvious way to try to make
You don't
something.
get the same flavors from hops. I mean, you can. The descriptors might be the same, but
Yeah, I know
the
that's
flavor is
fine.
different.
Maybe if you can get juniper, yeah, that's the same. The thing, maybe.
I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there are juniper varieties in South America that you can also try, but my experience with American beers using American species, North American species of juniper is they got really interesting flavors, and they were not the same.
No,
they were different.
it's something you can replace. Maybe that happens.
Yeah, we will start exporting juniper branches to you
It's a
at a
business.
very high price.
Yeah. Well, you already talked about Gale. Is there any other
Yeah.
spice that we use traditionally in these beers?
Yes, there were a few. This has been very hard to research. So, because if you look at uh, old books on brewing, old books on herbs and medicinal herbs, basically they say that everything was used. Like if it was green and it grew somewhere, they used it in beer, which is not reliable. So what I did was I took all of the descriptions that I could find and counted how many mentioned each individual herb, and then you get actually a quite clear picture with some regional variation. And the main thing that stands out is everyone used hops, almost everyone used juniper, and then all the other herbs are rare. At least in the late 19th, early 20th century. Maybe it might well have been different further back in time. There was Mirica Gale has flavor-wise a cousin. So it tastes similar. It's harsher and more bitter, but people thought of them as being close and gave them similar names. And the other one is called Wild. What is it? Wild Labrador Tea. It's Rhododendron tomentosum is the new Latin name, and the old one is it doesn't matter. That was also used, and it's quite similar, but it doesn't grow everywhere. People use something called St. John's wort. That was used quite a bit in Norway. Caraway was used. Caraway actually in Norway was used very commonly as a spice, so commonly that in many places it was just called spice because it was the only one. Mm-hmm. And there are also some other relatively rare plants that were used. And an interesting one is called Polypodium. It's a fern, but it's a very specific species of fern. Yeah, it's when you chew the root, it tastes like licorice, sweet licorice. Mm. And that they use this root to make the beer sweeter. And I found a paper that analyzed it chemically. It turns out there is a chemical in there that's 500 times as sweet as sugar. And somehow they figured this out. Yes, this group of chemists named the chemical like in the 1990s. They called it oslanin.
Oh, that's the when you have time to try many things. We are really used to this idea.
They knew a lot of these plants and what properties they had. Absolutely.
So the next question is about, for example, if you see like the sensory characteristics of these beers made with this special kind of yeast, is there any special flavor or off flavor that that is considered a defect by these traditional brewers? Like maybe any special?
Yeah, sour beer.
Yeah, when they
really hate sour beer. Um, that's the, like, if you look at beer flaws that people describe historically, then there is a classic kind of too bitter or too watery, not strong enough, and then it's sour. And in Denmark, and for some reason only in Denmark, they talk about ropey beer, which they actually call long beer. And
Ropey, like something.
it's some species of bacteria make polysaccharides, and when you take the beer from your mouth, it's like long threads that hang between your mouth and the glass.
Like
And
that.
if there is enough of it, when you pour the beer, it's kind of gloopy. It's kind of falls into the glass. But historically, they had actually beer flaws that were worse than this, because if you had fungus on the grain while it was growing in the field, or it got moldy but you couldn't see it when you were malting it, then people would get sick. Like they would get the runs, or they would start vomiting when they drank the beer. And of course, if this was a wedding beer or something like that, it was not a lot of fun.
Yeah, great shame for the brewer.
Great shame for the brewer, and also all your houses are full of vomiting, diarrhea, sick people.
That's really good. Well, many of us got to know about Kveik when all the hype around making really hoppy beers with this yeast because of their fruity flavors. So there's a lot of brewing being done with these yeast and high rates of hops. But what's the traditional amount of hops in this kind of beers for Norwegian brewers?
Right. I guess by now you can guess the answer. Over the place, right?
Yeah.
So some regions like Sogn, Hardanger, Voss seem to have used a lot of hops. Some places, and then their neighbors used almost none. And then parts of Norway, it was like 0.5 gram per liter. And this isn't high alpha acid hops. The percentage seems to be like on average around 4%.
Really continental hops.
Yes, flavor-wise, Norwegian hops seems to have been highly variable. So continental noble hops has the signature that you get when it's gone through domestication and systematic growing. The genetic variation goes like this. That never happened in Scandinavia. So there is greater variety genetically in Scandinavian hops than there is in continental ones. So it seems that there is variation in the character, but this hasn't been explored very much.
I see. And when you talk about a lot of hops, like in Voss or these other places, is there any kind of data about how many grams per liter, per example?
Yeah, I've seen like 10, 15, up towards 20.
Oh, that's really lots of hops. Yes. Really weird.
But data on this is very sparse, and I haven't included the ones where they count the hops in handfuls. Yeah. But I will start doing that.
And so, because hops are sometimes they're really tough. For example, if you want to reuse your regular yeast, because they are, because of their properties. So given that these places used to use this amount of hops, are we able to say that maybe Kveik is a little bit more resistant to these properties of hops, or not necessarily?
We don't know.
Because that's an amount of hops that's perfect for a modern IPA. So that's the question. It's really, really...
Kveik does work well with modern craft hops and in IPA, absolutely. Is that any relation with brewers in Western Norway using a lot of hops? I don't know.
Oh yeah, that's really hard to test. But so the next question. Sorry, I got kind of lost. Some brewers actually are using Kveik, but fermenting it at really low temperature, and they've been having some good results. And this characteristic used to be, we used to believe that it only belonged to lager yeast. How can we explain this this ability of withstanding the cold? Maybe of the same genetic root as the high temperatures, or?
Yes, I think it's to do with the different stress response in Kveik, but nobody knows this for certain. Nobody's done any serious research on it.
I see. This question has a little bit of speculation, but do you think it's possible to find any hybrid between Kveik and Eubayanus, like this ancestor?
Well, that's an interesting question. Well, if we think about this systematically, it seems that this German practice of fermenting cold to avoid lactic acid bacteria and so on meant that when this hybrid happened, it had an advantage in German brewing, and therefore it took over. But in Norwegian brewing, they pitched at body temperature and they insulated the fermenter. And then you have 150 liters and you ferment really fast. So it's releasing a lot of heat very quickly. So the temperature goes up. So we don't know if Eubayanus ever existed in Norway. I mean, nobody has any idea. But if it did, a hybrid like that wouldn't have good conditions to thrive in. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. So there's one flavor characteristic that you already addressed, that milky caramel from Horndal. Can we get back a little bit at that, and how would you describe it with more detail?
Because it can take on different aspects. So the first couple of times that I came across it, it was quite strong, and there was more going on, and the reaction from experienced tasters that tried those beers was like, what was this? And I haven't really tasted it like that since. There's been more this it's hard to describe. It's kind of you know it when you taste it kind of thing. And it's thought that it may be the bacteria that make that flavor, because all of these Hornindal Kveiks have bacteria in them, several species, but they don't do the beer any harm. Quite the opposite, they seem to improve it, and they don't make it sour. Confusingly.
For example, I use it, so but I use the pure culture from Omega yeast. So the definition is it's a really special yeast. I actually don't think, at least for the one that I get, that has that fruity characteristic. But it's like maybe earthy, a little bit of caramel. So that's an interesting question because it's the one that, at least in Chile, with Voss, the one that you can find.
Right.
So let's talk a bit about Kveik today, because all around the world they're being used to brew, and it's really common. Well, it's getting common to find them in the bars. Do you think that a customer understands when they read Kveik in these places what we were talking about?
No, but they don't in Norway either. So, I mean, in Norway, we have the system where any beer above 4.5% must be sold through a government monopoly. And one of the benefits of this government monopoly is that all the employees are trained on their products, and they can answer your questions, about wine and beer, and they can help you and so on. And my local shop, these are professionals selling beer, right? I tried to ask them about Kveik, or even, do you have any, Norwegian style beer? They don't even understand the question. What is a Norwegian style beer? Not even now in 2020. So Norwegians going to a bar and they see, all these beers, and one says Kveik, is like, they don't know what it is. Doesn't mean anything to them. So in South America, probably people don't know, would be my guess.
Yeah, for sure. It's really weird to listen to that. For example, in that, if you were to work at this place like a professional beer selling person, how would you explain a customer that's never listened about Kveik?
It's pretty easy. I mean, what you say is that this is the yeast that they've had in this village since forever, that they inherited from father to son through many generations, and it's the one that they used when they brewed traditionally in that area, and they still have it. Yeah. That's how I would explain it. I mean, that's the story and the kind of the punchline.
Yeah, nobody cares about that they can ferment really fast. But yeah, I know.
I mean, tell a consumer that I fermented this beer really fast, like 150 kilometers an hour. I mean,
yeah.
You can talk about the flavor, but so it depends on what the question is. I mean, you could talk about the flavor where you can taste it, but it's not necessarily where you would start, I don't think.
Yeah, it's perfect. Have you brewed any style of beer that you think that doesn't go well with Kveik?
Well, Saison. Because Kveik doesn't make most of the Belgian styles, because the beers are usually supposed to be phenolic, and Kveik doesn't do that. Hefeweizen, not a great fit, also supposed to be phenolic. And then I suppose there are, like, maybe Kölsch wouldn't be a good fit unless you really took good care to use a neutral Kveik and tune the flavor down. But I mean, it is a beer one yeast, so that means it's a natural fit for all the English styles, and you can decide if you want a lot of flavor or you tune it down. But a lot of the English yeasts actually are surprisingly flavorful. Like the Fuller's yeast has this kind of marmalade flavor to it that's quite strong. So,
In the other side, is there any style? For example, if someone wants to make their first homebrew with Kveik, some styles that really shine with Kveik yeast?
Well, that's a good question. Of course, it's a little different in the homebrew setting, but
for any brewer, in that.
Yeah. I mean, the IPAs are actually a natural fit, because you can drink the beer while the hops are still fresh.
Yeah.
Which is actually an advantage. And anything that's supposed to be where you really want that fruity character. And unexpected, I mean, it's not going to be your first brew, I don't think, but one place where it fits surprisingly well is smoky beers. Quite often the combination of Kveik and smoke turns out to be just magical. And of course, a lot of Norwegian beer was smoky historically. Not all of it, but a lot of it.
Well, even where almost everywhere before, like, good malting techniques.
No, this is a myth. I'm sorry. This is false.
Really? Like when
People
before, like
dried
indirect?
the. Well, remember that there's most brewers were not commercial brewers, right?
Yeah.
Everywhere. Yeah, and a very common method for them to dry the malt was in the sun. And another was just to put it on a floor and heat the room. So
The smoke is more intentional, you think?
well, from my statistics, it's something like 1/3 not smoky at all, 1/3 lightly smoky, and 1/3 strongly smoky. Of course, this is late 19th century, but there was nothing about this technology that fundamentally changed very much.
Well, thanks for the feedback in that. So do you think? Well, do you think that in the future they're gonna be more strains of Kveik coming out from the labs?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's something that the commercial yeast labs haven't really woken up to yet. The number and variety of Kveik strains, and that's something that probably I think there will be more interest in. Yeah,
Cool.
Absolutely.
Can you tell us, because we are already over time, a little bit about the farmhouse ales yeast that from Russia, Poland, or other countries that are not that close to Norway?
Right. So all of those things that I told you about Kveik, they no longer apply when we talk about the Baltics and Russia. So now suddenly you see hybrids between different species. You see species of wild yeast in there, and they don't seem to all belong to one family. There are a few hints that there might be a Baltic family of farmhouse yeast. And these yeasts a lot of them are phenolic. But they're still not like saison yeast. They're not diastatic, for example. Oh, except of course there is one that's diastatic.
Yeah, and
the Juvaru alus yeast is diastatic.
And they get fermented also as high, the one with phenols. Yes. Oh, cool.
Yeah. So in Russia, the first brewer I met who had her own yeast, I asked her what temperature she fermented at, and she said, I don't know. So she would taste the wort, and then she knew when it was right. Then I put the thermometer in, and 39 degrees.
Yeah.
And a lot of the Lithuanians are 35. It's quite common. Fermenting at body temperature was the normal in the UK, in Denmark, in Sweden, in Finland, in all the Baltics, in Russia, in Norway, everywhere that we have data for.
So, well, I guess we're done, and it's been really, really, really interesting talking to you, and it's so sad. Maybe just a second. Oh well, we have a little bit of a tradition. We end with one question that's not related with beer. In this case, the one is because many people relate like Nordic countries with heavy metal and metal as a genre. Are you a fan? Any band from Norway that maybe you could recommend?
I've never been a fan of the kind of black metal stuff.
Yeah.
I got into progressive rock, and from there I went into jazz. So I listen to a lot of, well, some Norwegian jazz as well, actually. Jan Garbarek, I've listened a lot to. He's really quite the major character. But if you're into black metal, I don't think you'll like his music.
Oh, but Norwegian jazz sounds just as interesting. So maybe you could write it in the chat, because it's really hard to
Sure.
understand from the pronunciation.
Yeah.
Great.
And if you can have some more.
Oh, great. So, yeah. So I want to take just a moment to really thank you for all this research. I'm a Kveik brewer myself, so I've been really fascinated with these yeasts. I'm going to be using them for a long time, probably, and so I'm really happy to be able to talking to you. And I'm going to let Fabian like close the interview and all. And so really thanks, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. A lot of good questions, and thank you for your interest in traditional brewing.
No, for sure. So bueno, Fabián va a seguir con el...
Sí, hola chicos. Lars, thank you so much for your time, for all of your talk. Really, it's very, very interesting. And we like with Jose to make a traditional Norwegian
Norwegian.
Ah, I'm sorry. But thank you so much, really. Y también, en Spanish, thank you y gracias a toda la gente que nos acompañó el día de hoy en esta nueva versión de la entrevista académica. Los invitamos a mantenerse activos y atentos a las nuevas entrevistas. El próximo martes nos vemos con una entrevista acerca de sidras argentinas. Así que todos desde ya invitados, tanto a mantenerse atentos a nuestras redes sociales como a nuestro canal de YouTube, en donde podrán encontrar todas las grabaciones de la entrevista, incluyendo esta. Thank you so much, Lars, and see you in the other moment.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great night.